I bet $100 you can't find your way home. That's what my mother yelled through a car window when I was 11. Then she laughed. My father laughed too, and I stood there inside 30th Street Station, staring at the only two people who were supposed to protect me as they drove away, like my panic was part of the joke. I had $8 in my pocket. No phone, no address, no real idea how to get home. What they didn't know was that moment would follow all of us for years. Because 18 years later, after the stores were gone, the lies were public, and no one was left to save them. My phone lit up with 23 missed calls from Pennsylvania. And that was the morning they finally learned something I'd known for a long time. I did find my way home. I just never came back to theirs. I was standing in my kitchen when my phone started lighting up again. By the time I picked it up, there were 23 missed calls from a Pennsylvania number I didn't recognize. I told myself it could be spam, a wrong number, somebody looking for a business contact. But my coffee had already gone cold in my hand, and I think part of me knew before I even opened the voicemail. Some memories don't fade, they wait. I hadn't lived in Pennsylvania in 18 years. I hadn't used my old name in almost as long. I built my life in Seattle on purpose, piece by piece, quiet enough that the past couldn't find me unless someone went looking. And someone had. That was the part that got me. Not the calls. The effort behind them. When I saw the message request, then the email, then the voicemail, I felt that old pull in my chest. The one I hadn't felt since I was 11 and stranded in Philadelphia. And that's when I knew this wasn't random. It was my past, finally deciding to introduce itself. I set the phone face down and just stood there, staring at my counter like it might explain something. But all I could see was 30th Street Station, the big clock, the polished floor. Me at 11, trying not to panic in a place that felt too loud and too large all at once. That's the strange thing about certain memories. You don't revisit them. They take you. I hadn't thought about that day in years, not in any real way. I'd buried it under work, distance, a new name, a different life. Part of me thought that meant I was over it. It didn't. It just meant I got better at walking around the wound. And the second those calls came in, I knew exactly which part of my life had come back, because before I was Claire Morgan, I was the girl they left behind. If you'd seen my family from the outside, you probably would have liked them. My parents owned a small chain of home goods stores in Maple Grove, Pennsylvania. My father grilled on weekends. My mother waved at neighbors like she'd been born for it. We had the kind of house people pointed at when they wanted to talk about good values and hard work. That was the version they sold. Inside the house, everything worked differently. My mother had this way of turning cruelty into a lesson. That was her favorite word. Lesson. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I asked for help, I was helpless. If I made one mistake, it somehow meant I needed to be taught something. And my father never stopped her. Most of the time, he looked entertained. That part took me years to say out loud. Not because it wasn't true, but because it sounded too ugly in plain English. Kids will protect a lie if the truth feels worse. I got good at reading moods early. The sound of a cabinet closing. The way my mother set down a glass. My father's face when he was already halfway into a joke. You learn small things when home doesn't feel steady. You learn when to stay quiet. When to disappear. When not to give anyone a reason. On paper, we were a normal middle-class family. In real life, love was always tied to performance, and safety depended on whether my mother was bored. Looking back, that was the system. I just didn't know yet how far they were willing to take it. One of my earliest memories is sitting on a bench outside a shoe store, staring at my own sneakers because the toes were split open, and I'd made the mistake of asking for a new pair. My mother said I was acting spoiled. Then she left me there to think about gratitude. My father came back hours later smiling like he'd won something. That was how it worked. Never one big explosion. Just a pattern. At first, I kept trying to make it make sense. I thought maybe I was too emotional, too needy, too difficult. Kids do that. We'd rather blame ourselves than admit the adults in charge enjoy the damage. That realization came later. When I was 10, some boys mocked me after a football game. I got in the car crying, and instead of comforting me, my parents drove to the far end of the lot and told me to get out. My mother said tears made people weak. My father said maybe I'd learn faster alone. They left me there after sunset and came back with food for themselves. That was the rhythm of my childhood. Public place, small mistake, their lesson, my humiliation. And it never looked dramatic from the outside. That's what made it worse. No bruises, no screaming neighbors, just two respectable adults turning fear into a family activity. They always had language for it. Resilience, character, tough love. People like that hide behind clean words because the truth sounds exactly as ugly as it is. I started adjusting without even knowing I was doing it. I watched their faces before I spoke. I measured my tone. I stopped asking for things unless I'd rehearsed the request in my head 3 different ways. Even then, part of me usually decided it wasn't worth it. That's what long-term fear does. It doesn't just hurt you, it trains you. I became quiet, useful, easy to overlook. I learned how to take up less space at the table, less space in a room, less space in my own life. And the worst part was, after a while, that started to feel normal. Not good, not safe, just familiar. The only place I felt even a little like myself was when I drew, on receipts, homework margins, cheap sketch pads, anything I could find. I didn't have the words for escape back then, but I knew what it felt like to build a door in my head and step through it for a minute. Looking back, I think part of me already knew I would need a way out. I just didn't know they were about to hand me one. I walked through the front door holding my report card like it meant something. Art was the one class that felt honest to me, and that B+ wasn't failure in my mind. It meant I'd tried. It meant I cared. For about 5 seconds, I let myself feel proud. Then I saw my mother's face. She was standing in the kitchen with the paper in her hand, reading it like she'd caught me doing something shameful. My father leaned over, glanced at the grade, and gave me that look I already knew too well, the one that said this was about to become entertainment. My mother asked how I could spend so much time drawing and still disappoint her in the one subject I supposedly loved. My father said maybe talent had made me lazy. I remember standing there trying to decide which version of myself might survive that conversation. That night I heard them talking in the kitchen after dinner. Low voices, small laughs, the kind that always made my stomach tighten. And that's when I knew the grade wasn't the real issue. I was. The next morning, my mother made pancakes. That should tell you everything. In our house, kindness usually meant strategy. My father even asked if I wanted orange juice, which was so out of character it should have warned me. But I was 11, and some part of me still wanted to believe people could wake up different. They said we were taking a day trip into Philadelphia. Just the 3 of us. My mother smiled too easily. My father had the radio up the whole drive, tapping the steering wheel like he was in a good mood. I remember watching the road and trying to settle the feeling in my stomach. I knew something was off. I just didn't know how bad. On the way there, my mother kept turning around to ask me questions that didn't sound like questions. Did I think I was smart? Did I think smart girls were ready for the real world? Did I think life cared if I was scared? Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them. Every silence made them push a little harder. By the time we got into the city, I had that familiar feeling, like the room had changed before anyone admitted it. 30th Street Station was bigger than anything I was used to. Loud, polished, crowded, full of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. I stayed close to my parents because I didn't know where else to stand. That's the part people don't always understand. Fear doesn't make you run. Sometimes it makes you cling to the people hurting you because they're still the only map you have. Inside the station, my mother pointed to a large pillar near the main hall and told me to wait there while they moved the car and grabbed lunch. 15 minutes? Maybe 20? I asked if I could come with them. My father laughed loud enough for strangers to glance over. My mother leaned in and told me not to embarrass her in public. So I stayed. At first, I kept checking the clock. 15 minutes? 30. 45. I made excuses for them because that felt safer than the truth. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe parking took longer. Maybe the line for food was wrapped around the block. An hour in, my chest started to hurt. By an hour and a half, my hands were shaking. I had $8 in my pocket. No phone, no written address, no idea how the trains worked. I'd never felt that small in my life. I kept stepping away from the pillar, then walking back to it. Even then, part of me was still trying to follow instructions. That's what control does. It stays with you after the person leaves. The station only got louder as the afternoon dragged on. Announcements echoed overhead. Suitcases rattled across the floor. Every woman with dark hair made me look up. Every passing minute stretched wider than it should have. And then I saw the car. It moved slowly past the front windows just outside the station. My whole body lit up with relief so fast it almost hurt. I ran toward the glass, waving both arms like that could bring everything back into place. For 1 second, I thought they'd come back. I didn't know yet that the worst part wasn't being left there. It was what they did next. I ran all the way to the window, both hands up, trying to get their attention like maybe this was finally over. I could see my father at the wheel. My mother was in the passenger seat. And for one stupid, hopeful second, I thought they were coming back, because they'd realized they'd gone too far. That's the part that still stays with me. Not just the fear. The relief first. My father looked right at me. He smiled. Not the kind of smile you give a scared kid when you're fixing a mistake. It was the smile of somebody waiting for a joke to land. Then my mother rolled down her window just enough for me to hear her over the traffic. She said, "I bet $100 you can't even find your way home." And then they both laughed. My father lifted his hand off the wheel like he was proud of himself. Just this quick little gesture, like the whole thing had gone exactly the way they planned. Then the car kept moving. No hesitation, no second thought. Just gone. I remember standing there with my arms still half raised, like my body hadn't caught up yet. That was the moment something in me changed. Before that, I was still trying to make excuses for them. I thought maybe they were late, maybe they forgot, maybe I was overreacting. Kids will do that when the truth is too painful. We soften it so we can survive it. But after that, I knew. My fear wasn't an accident. It was the point. I walked back inside because I didn't know what else to do. I cried, then stopped, then cried again. I sat down, stood up, circled the same stretch of floor until my legs hurt. I kept wiping my face because even then I was embarrassed to be seen upset. They had trained that into me too. And somewhere in those next few minutes, the waiting ended. That's different from being left. Waiting still has hope in it. Abandonment doesn't. I didn't know it yet, but someone had already started noticing me. I was walking past the same row of seats again when a woman in a station uniform stepped in front of me and asked if I was lost. She wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't crowd me. She just looked at me like she'd already noticed something wasn't right. Her name was Linda. I lied at first. I said I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long. I said I didn't know. Then she asked if I'd eaten. And that was it. That one question broke whatever I'd been using to hold myself together. I started crying so hard I could barely answer her. I told her they left me there. I told her they drove past and laughed. I told her my mother bet money on whether I could find my way home. And Linda didn't do what my parents would have done. She didn't call me dramatic. She didn't tell me to calm down. She lowered her voice and said, "You're safe right now. I'm going to help you." I still think about that sentence. Sometimes rescue doesn't sound big, sometimes it sounds calm. Then she reached for the phone and called security. And that's when the adults around me stopped treating it like a lesson. I sat in a small office with a paper cup of water in my hand while security reviewed the station cameras. One officer asked me the same questions 3 different ways: my parents' names, our address, what car they drove, how long I'd been there. I kept waiting for someone to tell me I was overreacting. No one did. That may sound small, but when you grow up in a house like that, being believed feels almost unnatural. Part of me was still bracing for the turn, for the moment some adult would shrug and call it a misunderstanding. That's what I'd been trained to expect. Clean excuses, softer words, a version that protected them. Then they reached my parents by phone. I could only hear one side of it, but I'll never forget the officer's face. It changed fast. He listened for a second, then said, very clearly, "No, ma'am. Leaving a 11-year-old alone in a major train station is child abandonment." That word hit me harder than I expected. Not because it felt too strong, because it fit. For the first time, somebody called it what it was. Not a lesson, not discipline, not tough love, just harm, spoken plainly. And once the truth had a name, everything after that started moving. I remember the courtroom chairs more than anything else. Hard, stiff, designed for waiting. My parents sat across from me looking annoyed, not ashamed. My mother wore pearls. My father kept leaning back like the whole thing was beneath him. Even then, part of me kept hoping they'd say the one thing that could have changed everything. We were wrong. They never did. They admitted leaving me at the station. That wasn't even the fight. Their argument was that it had been controlled, educational, necessary. My mother called it resilience. My father called it preparing me for the real world. Listening to them dress up cruelty in polished language was its own kind of injury. Some people don't rewrite the past because they forgot it. They rewrite it because the truth costs too much. The court gave them a path forward. Parenting classes, therapy, supervised visits, time to prove they could change. On paper, it looked fair. In real life, they treated oversight like humiliation. They hated being watched more than they hated losing me. Then came the choice: commit to the reunification process or voluntarily surrender their parental rights. They chose surrender. Just like that. I wish I could tell you I broke down right there. I didn't. I went still. That was worse. Because in that moment, I understood something I'd been resisting for years. I had spent my whole childhood trying to be manageable enough to keep their love. But it was never about me being difficult. It was about them refusing to be decent. They didn't lose me. They let me go to protect their pride. And after that, my life started moving in a direction none of us could have imagined. The first night at the Morgans' house, Susan asked if I wanted spaghetti or soup. I remember just standing there, staring at her, because no one had ever asked me a question like that and actually meant it. David took my bag without making a scene. There was a lamp on by the door, framed pictures on the wall, and a dog sleeping somewhere in the back of the house. Everything felt ordinary, which is probably why it felt so unreal. I didn't trust it at first. That's the part people romanticize later. They hear foster home or adoption and imagine instant safety. But when you grow up around instability, kindness can feel suspicious. I kept waiting for the switch. The joke. The catch hidden behind the nice tone. It never came. Susan knocked before entering my room. David noticed I drew and started leaving old art books near the table like it wasn't a big deal. Nobody demanded gratitude. Nobody asked me to perform healing on schedule. They just stayed steady, And steadiness can feel almost supernatural when you've never had it. Over time, that house stopped feeling temporary. Then it stopped feeling borrowed. By the time the adoption became official, the emotional part had already happened. When they asked if I wanted to change my name, I said yes, without hesitation. Emily Caldwell belonged to the girl they abandoned. Claire Morgan belonged to the life that kept me. And once I had that name, I started becoming the person who could carry it. I used to sit at a desk in Philadelphia long after midnight, moving shapes around a screen and realizing I felt calmer when things made sense. Maybe that's why design fit me so well. It gave me a way to take noise and turn it into structure. After years of surviving other people's chaos, that felt almost revolutionary. I went to school, worked part-time, kept drawing, kept going to therapy, even when I hated it. Healing wasn't clean, and it definitely wasn't quick. Part of me was building a future while another part still flinched when someone said, "I'll be right back." Trauma doesn't always leave dramatically. Sometimes it leaves in layers. After college, I moved to Seattle for a design job and never looked back. The air felt different there. Drier. Lighter. Far enough from Pennsylvania that distance itself started to feel protective. I worked hard, took freelance clients on the side, and eventually opened my own studio. Clean branding, visual identity, small business work. The kind of job where people hire you to help them say clearly who they are. I always noticed the irony in that. My whole career was built on clarity, and I came from people who lived by distortion. Somewhere in those years, I met Michael. He was steady in the kind of way that doesn't ask for applause. We built a quiet life together. Good work, good marriage, morning coffee, a rescue dog named Buddy. Sunday calls with David and Susan. Nothing flashy, just real. And after a while, peace stopped feeling temporary. That was the life I had when Pennsylvania found me again. I sat at my kitchen table and finally played the voicemail. It wasn't my mother. It was my younger sister Rachel, and I hadn't heard her voice in years. She sounded older, thinner somehow, like life had worn the softness out of it. She didn't waste time. She said our mother had late-stage cancer. She said our father had a stroke 6 months earlier. Then she said the stores were gone. Not struggling. Gone. I remember staring at the wall after that, trying to catch up to the words. Part of me had imagined my parents as frozen in time, still standing behind those counters, still living inside the version of themselves they sold to everyone else. I hadn't pictured collapse. I hadn't pictured consequences showing up that late and all at once. Rachel told me it started with a comment. My mother had posted under somebody else's parenting thread about how kids today needed stronger discipline. That was all it took. A relative brought up the old station story. Then neighbors started talking. Someone dug up an old article tied to the custody case. A former employee added their own story, and once the image cracked, it didn't stop. That's the thing about reputation. It looks solid until truth gets one clean opening. Customers stopped coming. People in town started avoiding the stores. Church friends went quiet. Civic groups distanced themselves. The same community that used to protect my parents with politeness turned on them with gossip. And honestly, that part felt painfully familiar. Small towns don't always care about the truth first. They care about when the truth becomes public. By then, the business had already been weakening. My father's health got worse. My mother kept pushing appearances long after appearances stopped working. One by one, the stores either closed or got sold off at losses. The house was gone too. Rachel said they were living in a subsidized apartment outside town now, with no money, no status, and no version of their old life left to hide inside. Then she said the real reason for the 23 calls. They wanted me to come back. Not because they had changed, not because they were finally brave enough to tell the truth, because they were scared, out of options, and suddenly aware that dying looks different when the people you hurt don't come running. I asked Rachel why she was the one calling. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Because I read the records, and for the first time, I know what they did to you." That should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like the past had just opened its front door. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my phone like it belonged to somebody else. Rachel kept talking, careful, almost apologetic, but by then I already understood what mattered. They weren't reaching out because love had finally found its voice. Love doesn't usually arrive after bankruptcy, illness, and public disgrace. Need does. That realization landed harder than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because some old part of me still wanted a different reason. Even after everything, there was a piece of me that wanted to believe age might have made them honest. It hadn't. It had just made them desperate. Rachel said they were scared of dying alone. She said they wanted to see me, talk to me, maybe make peace. But peace wasn't really what they were asking for. They wanted relief. They wanted comfort from the very person they once treated as disposable. Some people don't come back because they changed. They come back because the bill finally reached them. And I had to decide what I was going to do with that. I booked the flight the next morning. Michael didn't try to talk me out of it. He just asked one question: was I going back for them or for me? That question stayed with me longer than it should have because I knew the answer mattered. If I went back hoping for repair, I was walking into the same trap with older faces, so I got honest. I wasn't going to rescue anyone. I wasn't going back to rebuild a family that had already made its choice. I was going because some endings need your own voice, not for drama, not for revenge in the loud sense, just closure, clean and final. The whole flight to Philadelphia, I kept waiting for guilt to show up. It didn't. Just tension. Just memory. Just that quiet feeling you get when the past stops being abstract and starts having a room number. By the time I got there, I knew exactly what I owed them. Nothing. But I still had something to say. I pushed open the hospital room door and saw them both at once. My father looked smaller than I remembered, like illness had stripped the performance off him. My mother still had that arranged expression, even sitting in a hospital bed like composure alone could negotiate with reality. For a second, nobody spoke. Then she said my old name. I corrected her once. Claire. That landed harder than anything else in the room. She started crying almost immediately. Not quietly either. The kind of crying that still expected to control the temperature around it. My father cleared his throat and said they had made mistakes. I remember looking at him and feeling almost nothing except clarity. Mistakes are missed exits, burnt dinners, forgotten appointments. What they did took planning. It took intention. It took two adults looking at a scared child and deciding her fear would be useful. So I told them that. I said, leaving a 11-year-old alone in 30th Street Station wasn't a parenting choice. It was abandonment. I said laughing while I panicked wasn't a lesson. It was cruelty. And I said the life they were living now, no stores, no standing, no daughters beside them, didn't come out of nowhere. Truth just takes longer to arrive for people who think image can outrun consequence. My father tried to interrupt. My mother asked if I could forgive them. That word almost would have moved me once. Not anymore. Forgiveness is meaningful when it's asked with honesty. Not when it's dragged out because the room got smaller and the options ran out. Then I said the line I think I'd been carrying for 18 years without knowing it. You bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. Neither of them had an answer for that. And that was the strangest part. I'd imagined this moment would feel explosive. It didn't. It felt precise, quiet, like setting down something heavy you should have dropped years earlier. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the truth, spoken by the person who survived it. I stood there another second, looked at them both, and realized I wasn't the one trembling anymore. What came next mattered even more than what I said. I picked up my bag before either of them could turn that silence into another performance. My father asked if this really had to be goodbye. My mother said they just needed help, some support, some kindness at the end. And there it was, the part underneath everything else. Not accountability, not truth, utility. I told them I wasn't paying bills. I wasn't managing care. I wasn't stepping back into a role they only valued when it made their lives easier. I said Rachel had every right to protect her child from people who confused control with love. And I said, my family was not sitting in that room asking me to prove I was a good person by abandoning myself again. That was the line for me. Not anger. Recognition. Some people call boundaries cold because they benefited from your lack of them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I just made it plain. What they lost wasn't access. It was entitlement. They had spent years treating me like I was disposable, and now they were asking to be handled with care by the same hands they once let go of. No, that word can sound harsh when people are used to your yes, but sometimes no is the cleanest thing you have. Then I walked out of that room knowing I wasn't leaving anything unfinished this time. I stood in the hospital parking lot with my keys in one hand and my chest finally starting to loosen. My hands were shaking a little, but not from doubt. More like release, the kind that shows up after you've carried something so long it started feeling like part of your body. On the drive back, I kept thinking about the girl at 30th Street Station. For years, some part of me believed being left meant being unlovable. Kids do that. We turn other people's cruelty into evidence against ourselves, because that feels easier than facing what they really are. But they were never the measure. That took me a long time to learn. What happened to me was not discipline. It was not toughness. It was not some character-building story I was supposed to thank them for later. It was abuse, dressed up in respectable language. And once I stopped softening that truth, everything in my life got clearer. Real love does not laugh when you're scared. Real family does not test whether you can survive without them. And healing doesn't start when the people who hurt you finally feel sorry. It starts when you stop waiting for them to become who they should have been. I have a good life now. A quiet one. A real one. People who love me without making me earn oxygen first. That is not luck. That is what happened when I stopped calling pain normal and started building something better. The family you come from can shape your wounds. It does not get to write your ending. Not everything called discipline is love. And not every family bond is healthy. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is tell the truth, stop excusing cruelty, and build a life rooted in peace instead of pain. That lesson gets clearer with age. Boundaries are not bitterness, and forgiveness is not the same as access. Real love is steady, safe, and honest. It doesn't humiliate you. It doesn't ask you to shrink just to keep the peace. Your past may shape your wounds, but it does not get to define your future. Healing begins the moment you stop calling harm normal and start choosing yourself.